Right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Seminar Series. For those folks that don't know me, I'm Andrew Paul, and I'm a Senior Science Advisor with the office, and I have been your host for this year's fall seminars. So on behalf of our entire team, we welcome you to today's event. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that in Alberta, we are on the traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Saulteaux nations, and homeland of the Métis. Their collective histories, languages, and cultures influence our communities to this day. And I ask wherever you find yourself, encourage you to recognize and acknowledge the relationship that First Nations, Inuit, Métis have with the land upon which you live, work, learn, and play. So before starting today's presentation or introducing today's presenter, I just want to take a brief moment to share some newly released indicators on alberta.ca. One of the key responsibilities of our office is to report on the condition of the environment in Alberta, and we work with several divisions within our Department of Environment and Protected Areas to do so. In collaboration with the Species at Risk Stewardship Branch, we've launched two new condition of environment indicators, including a vertebrate species indicator that reports on general status of the 5 vertebrate groups in Alberta between 2000 and 2020, and a vascular plant indicator that provides general status reporting on vascular plants in the province between 2015 and 2020. You can learn more about those indicators on alberta.ca. And at the end of today's presentation, Leanne will be putting the link to those condition of environment indicators into the chat box for you to look at. I want to remind folks again that your video and audio will have been disabled. That's to improve overall call quality. You can enter your questions or comments at any time during the presentation into the chat box. I will save those questions and comments until the end of the presentation, read them out to our presenter in the order that they were received. So with that, I'd like to welcome today's presenter, and that's Dr. Andy Crosby, who will be presenting on domains of scale and cumulative effects of energy sector development on boreal birds. Dr. Crosby is a quantitative ecologist specializing in wildlife ecology and management in northern forest and boreal ecosystems. Andy completed his PhD at Michigan State University in East Lansing. His research looks at the effects of forestry and energy development on birds and other wildlife species to inform management and policy decisions. Dr. Crosby is currently a research associate at the University of Alberta and research coordinator for the Alberta Biodiversity Conservation Program. This program focuses on understanding risks imposed on wildlife populations by oil sands development. So with that, Dr. Crosby, I will turn things over to yourself.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know we're all probably scrambling to get things done before the holidays. So I appreciate everyone being here today. And I'm here today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the problem of pattern and scale in ecology. And this is one of those problems that is maddeningly complex, can be really difficult to pin down, but also to some of us endlessly fascinating, probably partially because it's so complex. But this issue also has a big impact on applied ecology because it can really affect decisions that are being made by managers and policymakers based on the models that people like me are creating. So this is a talk about cumulative effects of oil sands development, but I'm going to start with some background in the ecological theory that really drives it. So without further ado, I will dive in. It is argued that the problem of pattern and scale is the central problem in ecology. This is how the 1989 MacArthur Award recipient, Simon Levin, began what has become one of the foundational papers in landscape ecology. And part of what he means by this is that the patterns we see when we observe anything in nature is conditional on the scale at which we observe it. So this is easy enough to see just by zooming out on satellite photos of oil sands development here in Alberta. Here in this first one, we're looking, I don't know, a few hundred meters squared, looking at some well pads. I'm not doing good here with the scrolling. You move that out a little bit and you see a very different picture of what's going on the landscape. Move it out even more, and you get a different picture again. And looking at any one of these might give you a different idea of how development looks in Alberta. Like a mural made of dots, the picture you see really depends on how far away you're standing. So getting back to Levin, 3 primary points that he makes in his paper. Number one is that there's no single natural scale at which it's to study an ecosystem. And so the grain and the extent of observation has to match the scale of the processes under investigation. For example, an individual animal habitat selection within a home range happens at a much smaller scale than selection of the home range itself, which happens at a smaller scale than the regional distribution of home ranges by multiple individuals. So asking any question about any one of these things requires a different frame of reference than the others. Number 2 is that patterns unique to any range of scales have unique causes and consequences. And so getting back to habitat selection, the habitat that an individual selects at any given point in time might depend on things like whether the animal is resting or feeding and the seasonal availability of specific food resources. On the other hand, home range selection depends on the availability of all the resources required by that individual during its time within the home range. And the third point is that observed patterns at one scale can be caused by processes operating at different scales. So the distributional pattern of home ranges that we observe at the regional scale depends on how individuals select home ranges at a smaller scale, but also on the availability of resources throughout the region, as well as the current density of the species in that region. So taken together, these 3 points explain a lot about why it's so difficult to extrapolate results from a study done at one scale to predict patterns at another scale. And so Levin concludes that given all these realities, it's imperative that we study how pattern and variability change with the scale of description. The same year that Levin won the award for his work on scale, John Wiens published what I would argue is one of the seminal papers in all of ecology. It's called Spatial Scaling in Ecology. And as part of his attempt to untangle the Gordian knot that is scale, Wiens proposed this idea of domains of scale. What he suggested is that there are ranges of the scale spectrum over which ecological relationships remain consistent or change monotonically, separated by these transition zones where relationships are highly variable and unpredictable. If we try to measure a phenomenon at too small of a scale, important elements of that pattern won't be observed. Whereas if we measure it at too large of a scale, important components of the pattern can get averaged out. Now, one of the few examples of research that actually explored this idea is a study by Matthew Wheatley done here in Alberta. So this is a plot from his manuscript showing changes in average forest patch size as a function of spatial aggregation of the point. So patches were measured at the point level, and if you start aggregating them at greater and greater extents, you get a different idea, you get a different measurement of average patch size. And what he used here was Kruskal-Wallis non-parametric post hoc test. So this being a non-parametric version of an ANOVA to determine which scales were the same and which scales were different in terms of average patch size. And in this example, He identified 9 separate scale domains in which patch sizes within the domains were not statistically different from each other, but patch sizes between the domains were significantly different from each other. "14 years after Wiens first proposed the idea of scale domains, Brandon Besselmeyer, in exploring how that idea can be applied to land management, linked scale domains to hierarchical levels of habitat selection. And in doing this, he proposed that there are habitat, landscape, and geographic domains corresponding to individual habitat selection, individual home range selection, landscape scale distributions of those home ranges, and the overall geographic range of the species, respectively. This is another great paper to read if you're interested in how scale applies to landscape management. But until the work I'm talking about, we did the work I'm talking about today, I haven't really seen another study that looks at this idea this way. Now, coming back to the patterns of oil sands development, I think the Wiens and Besselmeyer models provide a really good framework for thinking about how development affects wildlife, because now we have to think about cumulative effects. Cumulative effects management is becoming one of the major themes in boreal conservation across Canada. And the idea is that over various spatial extents, different types of human disturbances interact across space and time, causing changes to the landscape that affect ecological processes such as habitat selection and species dispersal. This is especially true in the oil sands region of northern Alberta, where human footprint from oil and gas development interacts with forestry, mainly, to create landscapes with no real historical analog. And past studies have shown additive and interactive effects of human footprint on bird species in Alberta. And detection of these effects can change with the spatial scale of analysis. For example, Bain et al. Showed that the ability to detect energy sector effects on bird abundances at the point scale increased with increasing point count radius. And Mahan et al. In analyzing data at larger scales found evidence of interactive effects of different footprint types for some bird species, meaning that the amount of one disturbance type can influence the effect of another type. The question remains, how might our conclusions about cumulative effects change when quantifying the same relationships at different spatial scales? In terms of sampling designs, there are a few different ways to characterize effects of scale on species at multiple scales. Probably the most common is to do it by considering multiple buffer sizes around each point, as we see here in A, and then summarizing the same habitat features at the different buffer sizes and selecting the best scale using some type of model selection procedure. And the best scale is often referred to as the scale of effect. Less often, researchers have modeled species occurrence abundance hierarchically by defining spatially nested subsets of observations, as seen here in B. And in this case, the extent at which samples are aggregated typically stays fixed. However, if the goal is to see how scale influences observed patterns, it is important to vary the sampling extent, as seen here in C, where the point level scale stays fixed, but the scale of aggregation changes. This is what we call the multi-level, multi-scale sampling design, and this design was the basis behind our analysis. So what we did was develop a study whose goal was to quantify the scale-dependent effects of oil sands development on birds in Alberta. And to do this, we articulated two primary objectives. The first was to directly compare human footprint effects on birds across multiple scales and to examine evidence for domains of scale in those effects. And we hypothesized that when comparing model coefficients across scales, we might find a pattern resembling the domain transition models proposed by Wiens and Besselmeyer. Our study area was nominally the boreal region of Alberta, but mainly within the oil sands region, as seen here in green. And this was a study designed, developed by Aaron Bain, what he calls the big grids, that allowed us to test our hypotheses about domains of scale. The idea behind the big grids was to understand effects of oil sands development at multiple spatial scales. And so grids were placed in areas with large footprints from steam-assisted gravity drilling leases. And these grids were paired with grids on areas that had some intermediate amounts of disturbance and others with very low amounts of disturbance. We had a total of 15 grids for our study, 5 in those highly disturbed landscapes. 4 of them were in intermediate landscapes. The intermediate landscapes being where a lot of exploration may have occurred, but no real drilling had started. There was no SAGD activity going on there. And 6 grids in low disturbance landscapes. These were landscapes that were either in protected areas or areas where there was little expectation of any energy development occurring. And these grids were 10 by 10 grids of sampling points with the points placed 600 meters apart, so covering a 6 kilometer by 6 kilometer area. And as you can see in this diagram, occasionally there were points that didn't get sampled for one reason or another, but in this case, it didn't really have any effect on the analysis. To collect data, we placed automated recording units at each sampling point. The recording units were there for at least 4 days. Each grid was sampled in a single year, sometime between 2014 and 2019. And they took at least one recording per day that was at least 3 minutes in duration. And so technicians randomly selected recordings that were at least 3 minutes long and listened to them, recorded all animal species heard, and then filtered those for recordings with excess external noise where things couldn't really be heard very well. And all of these recordings are stored on the WildTracks website. And these recordings for our study were further filtered by selecting only recordings that were done between May 19th and July 11th, between 4 a.m. and 10 a.m. that were, again, at least 3 minutes in duration, and only singing individuals were recorded on these. So our database ended up being singing individuals collected during 3-minute recordings within those date and time frames. And for habitat and human footprint data, at each point we use the ABMI land cover and human footprint information. For land cover, we collapsed the ABMI ecosystem types into 5 upland and 3 lowland habitat types. And within a 150-meter radius, we classified each point according to the dominant habitat type, defined as the habitat type covering the most area. We also calculated area-weighted mean forest age within that 150 meters. And at what we'll call the block level, which was a 600-meter squared block around the 600 by 600 meter block around that point, we derived the proportion of the area in 4 human footprint categories. These were seismic lines, wide linear disturbances like roads and pipelines, well pads, and industrial facilities. And to address our question, we created a subsampling design within the blocks where points were aggregated into progressively larger blocks from 1 by 1, where a block only contained 1 point, to up to 5 by 5, where a block contained 25 points. These blocks corresponded to 5 separate scales of analysis. To get equivalent sample sizes among the scales, we used a moving window design and randomly selected 300 blocks at each scale. And this gave us 2 levels for analysis, the point level and the block level. Our primary modeling challenge here was to separate the point level habitat effects from the block level human footprint effects, because the block scale, that's the scale that we were interested in looking at human footprint. So to do this, we developed a hierarchical occupancy model that estimated expected occupancy rate at the block level as a function of human footprint while controlling for point level habitat. I want to describe this modeling framework in a little bit of detail. So I'm going to unpack the model one step at a time. But if you don't happen to be statistically inclined, don't worry about it because it's not really critical to understanding the results. So this is a hierarchical model in 3 parts. At the block level, like I said, which may have contained anywhere between 1 and 25 points, we modeled the occupancy probability as a function of human footprint variables and then converted this into the probability of occupancy at any given point, which can be called occupancy rate within the block. So what is the probability that going to any given point, you're going to find that bird species there? And this estimate ignored any effect of habitat at the point level. And then at the points within the blocks, in the second part of the model, we estimated occupancy probability at each point as a function of the dominant habitat type and the forest stage. And this part of the model ignored any effect of block level human footprint. And the final part of the model combined these 2 probabilities, estimating point level occupancy as the combination of block level and the point level probabilities. We also accounted for detection probability in the standard approach of modern occupancy models using multiple subsamples. So to get back to the objectives, we wanted to estimate the effective human footprint at different scales while controlling for point level habitat effects. To understand scale dependent effects, we needed to be able to directly compare model coefficients for human footprint variables across the scales. And to facilitate this, we used a technique called Bayesian lasso. And in a nutshell, Bayesian lasso is a continuous model selection technique that let us include all the variables while still comparing best models across scales. I'm not going to go into the Bayesian lasso procedure in any detail here, but I have some slides at the end in case anyone is interested in how it works once we get to the question portion. And we ran these models for 16 boreal songbird species, representing 5 general habitat associations, including open habitat and generalist species. This is usually where I take a moment so everyone can look over the species list and find their favorite species. Okay, so getting into results. I'm going to combine methods and results here a little bit going forward because I think it makes it a little easier to explain what we did. The first thing we wanted to do was to visually examine plots of the coefficients across scales to look for qualitative evidence of scale domains. And what this plot is showing is the estimated model coefficients for the effective total human footprint for all the species on the y-axis, and the 5 different scales on the x-axis. And more than the specific coefficient estimates, we want to look at the pattern among the scales. What we see pretty clearly is a range of positive and negative effects at the 1x1 scale, very little effect at the 2x2 and the 3x3 scales, and some very strong positive effects at the 4x4 and 5x5 scales. When we look at the coefficient estimates from the additive models, we see the same pattern. Here are the coefficient estimates from the additive models on the y-axis, with the individual coefficients on the x-axis and the scales separated by color. So like if you took the last plot and squeezed it down for each variable individually. We see the same pattern with the 1x1 scale in light blue, showing a small range of effects from negative to positive, 2x2 and 3x3 in green and yellow with little to no effect, and 4x4 and 5x5 in dark blue, and red showing strong, mostly positive effects. I want to highlight this for the wide, linear, and industrial footprint types just to try to make it a little bit more clear. Again, the light blue is the 1x1 scale. Dark blue and red are the 4x4 and 5x5 scales. To test that there are significant differences in coefficients among the scales, we did a Kruskal-Wallis test that looked at all the variables simultaneously. And we found that there were statistically significant differences among those scales. The second test was a Wilcoxon test for pairwise differences among the variables, or among the scales. And it showed that the 1x1 and the 3x3 scales were not significantly different from each other. But all three of those were significantly different from the 4x4 and 5x5 scales. So it separated out the smaller scales, 1, 2, and 3, from the larger scales, 4 and 5. The last result I'm going to show is this pie chart showing the proportion of species for which the different model types were the best model at each scale. So if you look at the top left corner, the 1x1, it shows the proportion of, it's pretty even distribution. So about 1/3 of the species, the total footprint model was the best. For another third, the additive model was the best, and for another third, for the rest of them, the interactive model was the best. And we see at these small scales, 1x1 and 2x2, pretty even representation of these models. But when you go up to the 4x4 and 5x5 scales, the total footprint models are the best at describing the response of most species. Looking at the 1x1 scale, there were 6 species that showed moderate to strong responses to human footprint at the 1x1 scale. The species that showed a negative response were all forest-associated species in Alberta. The Swainson's thrush, the blue-headed vireo, and the Connecticut warbler. That's not a big surprise. Also, unsurprisingly, the species that showed a positive response were all associated with open habitats: Lincoln sparrow, alder flycatcher, and clay-colored sparrow. These are the species that showed the moderate to strong positive effects at the larger scales, the 4x4 and the 5x5. And although they did come from different habitat associations, the one thing they all had in common is that they are associated with open or disturbed areas. Had a couple of unexpected results. One was that the ovenbird showed a moderate positive response to total footprint at the 5x5 scale. Surprising because they're typically associated with mature, undisturbed forests. Unclear whether this is an actual relationship or whether it's a quirk in the data. So that one would need a little more looking into. Another one is that the rose-breasted grosbeak showed a moderate negative response to total footprint at 4x4 and 5x5 scales, which is surprising because these are often associated with suburban areas and parks and ecological transition zones. So in a summary here, while we were able to detect effects of human footprint on some bird species, these effects were not consistent across scales. This is pretty important finding, I think, considering how models might be used for making management decisions. For example, using a model fit at one scale to predict effects at a different scale could easily over or underestimate the true effect of a particular management activity or even predict an opposite effect. A second point I want to make here is about the novelty of the sampling design and modeling framework. I suppose there might be other examples of grid-based designs that can be used to look at the continuum of scales the way the Big Grid program does, but if there are, I have not seen them. Likewise, the modeling approach we developed does two things that are different from a standard hierarchical occupancy model. Number one is that it looks at the effects of distinctly different factors between scales, rather than treating larger scale effects as simply random effects or using the same or similar variables just aggregated to larger scales. And the second is that it uses occupancy rate at a larger scale, rather than occupancy probability within that block level, that sampling unit. And this is what allows for direct comparison among scales. So the reason that this is important is that occupancy probability automatically increases with the extent of the sampling unit. And so using that metric would prevent the comparison of coefficients among the scales. And finally, with further development, this framework could allow for modeling the linkages between scales, thereby allowing cross-scale predictions by including processes operating at multiple scales to be included in the same model. And what we saw here was some pretty strong support for scale domains in the response of boreal songbirds to oil sands footprint, consistent with the Wiens and Besselmeyer model. And what we're likely looking at is effects on the habitat selection processes at the 1x1 scale, leading to altered landscape scale species distributions at the larger scales. These are reflecting individual and population processes, respectively. And this also links to hierarchy theory, which is that on the one hand, small scale processes happening at smaller scales aggregate to create larger scale patterns, but processes happening at these larger scales can also constrain what can happen at the smaller scales. So at the 1x1 scale, we're seeing really it's primarily the effect on individual habitat selection. It's not clear yet whether this is human footprint specifically or whether it's just loss of habitat in general. And that these are driving landscape scale distributional effects, but that cumulative area of disturbance keys those larger scale patterns where we see some of the open habitats disturbance associated species getting positive effects from total area of disturbance that seem to go beyond what you would get just by looking at the small scale habitat selection patterns. The negative effects on forest species were really only seen at the smallest scale. Landscape scale effects almost always positive, indicating that the main driver of occupancy is probably still the availability of nesting habitat at that smaller scale. But as I said, that as that total disturbance increases at larger scales, it seems to positively affect some other species without seeing the negative effect on the other species. So the next question here is whether there might be a threshold of total disturbance at which we could see strong negative effects on forest species. The main biodiversity effects seem to be these expanding populations of disturbance-associated species, rather than the declines in closed canopy forest species. However, because we use occupancy rather than abundance, it's possible that we might be missing declines in the abundance of some of those forest species. One possible consequence of the patterns we see is biotic homogenization, where bird communities in the oil sands might shift much more towards disturbance-associated species, especially if at some point there's a threshold where the provision of breeding habitat at small scales is no longer enough to offset the effect of larger scale total human footprint. So the big question for a lot of us here is, what does this mean for bird conservation? Well, one big lesson, I think, is that the cumulative landscape effects of individual disturbances aren't necessarily what we would see if we just tried to scale up a point level study. But the inverse might also be true, that we can't see the habitat selection effects of these disturbances if we're only looking at large scales. An easy first recommendation is that limiting total area of disturbance in any one area might be the best way to limit a potential biotic homogenization effect. However, predicting large-scale effects is going to require understanding how to link those individual and population processes. And so I think that should really be the next step in looking at how domains of scale affect our estimates of cumulative effects. And with that, I'll thank sponsors who provided resources for this study, and take any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Dr. Crosby. Crosby, really appreciate the the presentation and your answering of questions afterwards. I see that the link to the Office of the Chief Scientist's vertebrate and vascular plant indicators is in the chat box for those that are interested in following up on those. And with that, I want to thank everyone online for joining us today for these for the presentations, or for Dr. Crosby's presentation. I want to apologize. This is the last seminar of our fall series. We're going to have to cancel our next seminar due to an unforeseen issues that have arisen. So this is the last one of the fall. We will be starting up again on these science seminars in late January. The schedule for next, I guess the winter term, next series is not quite yet out. It's in the process of just being finalized, I think, now. So stay tuned. You'll see more information on those, with the first one in January starting towards the end of January. Again, I remind folks, if you're not on the mailing list, please send an email to epa.ocs@gov.ab.ca to be added to the invite list. And with that, we'll end our presentation today. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Crosby, for her very thought-provoking presentation today.